Hello, I'm Lauren Cederstrom. I'm the host of the All Around Grant Show. Today I have my co-host Diana Laundrie with me, and we have a lot of stuff to cover. First, I'm going to start out with a public document. This is from the North St. Paul Police Department. This is an incident report. It started on September 4th, 2019 at 1341 or in the afternoon. Okay, involvement subject, Jeffrey Charles Huber, 9520 Stillwater, Joliet Avenue, Stillwater. And here, I'll read the report. On Wednesday, 9/4/19 at 1341, Officer Alvin Ailes observed a vehicle parked next to dumpsters in McKnight Fields and 10th Avenue. Upon arrival, we observed the Minnesota license 705 VLD in the far field behind McKnight and softball fields with a trailer full of cedar planks. We spoke with the driver, Jeffrey Huber, who advised us he had permission from 622 School District to dumpster dive to repurpose the cedar wood. Huber provided me with the name and phone number he wrote down on this District 622 Operations Supervisor, Scott Peterson. I made contact with Peterson, who advised me that he remembers speaking with Huber because he mentioned he was the mayor of the city of Grant and wanted to go to the district dumpster for some wood. Peterson gave him the permission to go to the district dumpsters behind North High School. I asked Peterson if he gave Huber permission to go to the dumpsters behind McKnight Fields, and he advised that the dumpsters I was speaking of belonged to the city of North St. Paul, and he did not mean those dumpsters. I then made contact with the North St. Paul fire chief and advised him of the situation. The fire chief advised me he spoke with the Public Works to advise the wood is still owned by North St. Paul and was removed from one job site to be used at another. Mallinger advised Huber he needs to put the wood back due to it still being used by North St. Paul and being in a dumpster. Well, we stood by while Huber put all the wood back and was escorted away from the dumpster without incident. The other interesting thing with this...
I like the word that they used, escorted away.
The other interesting thing is he had pushed his mayor's card out there, but at the end he demanded the card back because I talked to the Officer Allen who was involved with this. Evidently, he must think that his business card is like the one that you get in Monopoly, the get out of jail free card. So he wanted to get it back to conserve it for the next use. But this is a public document. You can make your own conclusion of what you think this was, but you have to be careful when you're doing things because he was taking things that didn't belong to him and it was not available to him. So again, this adds to the stack of as many ICRs that I have on him dating back to about 2013 or 14. But I just thought I would share that with the public so they know what the mayor has been up to.
So the next time that he runs for mayor of the city of Grant, do you think that you could take a picture of one on one of his campaign cards there and just stamp over the top of it rather than like the word censored or whatever, you can put dumpster diver.
Yeah, dumpster diver. So that's that one. I thought that was very interesting. Of course, last month we had that discovery about the Shakopee School District and flopping of the business managers. I have heard nothing else about that, and there has yet to be an article in the White Bear Press stating that they have a new manager. Okay, so now we're going to the city council meeting. And
you just had one in February, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and what date was that?
That, I believe, was the 3rd of February. We just had a meeting, and it's kind of interesting. It's kind of things recycle all the time. And there's a business district. We only have a small business district. It's on either side of Lake Elmo along Highway 36. And it's considered our commercial area, and there's several lots, but there's one lot left that's still zone A1. And someone came in 3 years ago when I was on the council, and they wanted to put one of these storage facilities, but this is one of the high-end ones where these people bring their Ferraris and Maseratis and classic cars. It's kind of a recreational garage, and that was turned down. Well, it's really interesting. Now these people want to come and put in just a regular storage unit. And mind you, how much sewer and water does a storage unit need? None, other than one toilet. So a small sewer system would take care of that. But let's play the first clip, and we'll talk on the other side.
sure exactly what lot you were talking about. I mean, if it's, I mean, I think storage units, and I'd have to check, would probably only be allowed in the business zone. So to me, that would require rezoning,
Okay.
and that's not something we've done. From my standpoint, I probably would not be in favor of that, but.
So every other business there is in the business zone, obviously, and zoned for business, and that's the last lot that is still zoned A2. So is there a reason that we couldn't pursue switching it?
Well, can I keep the floor?
Please,
Mr.
yeah,
Mayor?
go ahead.
The only question I would have is it in the middle of a bunch of business zoning, or is it separate from the stretch of business zoning?
It's the very last lot that's
I
not.
don't know what that means. Is it
so-
contiguous to that, or?
It is.
not?
It connects right with
Connects
all the other.
right with the other one?
Correct,
but
yes,
it's
sir.
To one east or the west of that?
It would be east.
So it's the first, you see, so we cut off the commercial line here, and you
it's
want to extend the commercial line.
one
a
lot
little bit
over.
farther.
Yes, sir.
So it is at least contiguous to the
It is,
existing.
yes, sir.
business. That would be more palatable, maybe, but again, we haven't changed the zoning in a long time. So, I'm done.
I'm going to turn to our clerk real quick, Mr. Bettine.
Mayor, council members, the confusion came from your storage listed on your land use chart. It does not show any storage that is strictly allowed in GB. It shows that it's allowed, there's several different types, but it shows that it is allowed in storage as a principal use with a conditional use permit in all zones. Now, that being said, the city planner did kind of take a look at this because we had the inquiry, and I think she may want to explain some of the verbiage in that section.
They're talking about they have to rezone this when it's the lot right next to the business district. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit later on about another commercial thing they're putting in, and they're not rezoning it, they're letting it pass. It's really interesting to see how flexible these rules are depending upon who you are and how they twist and turn things.
And Mr. Cedarstrom, what I would like to see is I would like to see their plan that they had, their land use plan that they have submitted to the Metropolitan Council for approval. Because that land use plan more than likely should show, obviously, this commercial area, this business area, and then does it call out that there's just one little lot that is A2? I mean, does it do that? I mean, is this the kind of land use strategy that the Met Council is going to be supportive of? I don't think so, because generally they want consistency along a transportation corridor. And so this would not be consistent to have the whole rest of it as commercial, a business zone, but then leave one little lot open for only A1. And then this idea that, as the city clerk mentioned, that there are many different land uses that are agreeable or that would allow a storage area, a storage unit, provided that they have a conditional use permit. Well then, you know, why is it that they are just saying absolutely not? And I found it also fascinating that former mayor Tom Carr, who is now a council member, did not know what lot was being talked about. Because I'm assuming that in their council packet, they had a map of this particular proposal, that it showed exactly what lot was being talked about, and that he should have known since he's lived there a long time and he's been serving on the council for years and years and years and years.
Yes, it's very interesting, but again, what I'm trying to point out is how inconsistent these people are and how their reasoning goes back and forth like you can't believe. But let's play the next clip. And they talk about another proposal, the Supper Club on 15, or Manning and 96.
There isn't a storage use listed that is allowed in GB.
Yeah, so it would be, I'm going to jump in here.
Yep.
So you'd end up with a map amendment, you'd also end up with a usage change, and just in the interest of full disclosure, Mr. Bettine, this has been proposed, Mr. Carr may remember this, may not, has been proposed 5-6 years ago. We had another gentleman stand right where you are, asked exactly the same question, and at that time, the council told him that we weren't interested in taking those farm fields there, which is essentially where you are. By the time you spread that out a little bit, you've got a massive natural gas line there between you and Polywater. and you're in a cornfield. So taking and extending our general business down there is going to create for us at the time was unacceptable pressure for city water and city sewer. It is my goal up here, and it has been the goal of former and past councils, to resist city water and sewer in a very vigorous manner. And if we take that business district, in my mind, and slide it down, and that former council people said exactly the same thing, we're gonna create too much pressure. If we do that, we start sliding it down one, we're gonna go down another one, because there's a bunch of open land there. And then it's gonna go down one, and then the golf course is gonna come to us and say, well, this isn't very fair. You've got a bunch of general business here all along this corridor, so you're gonna be developing your entire corridor. I've got a golf course. I'd like you to take a look at this golf course for us. Our, or at least the mission as stated in our comp plan is to keep us rural residential, with that mix of farm, fields, and homes, and business has never been really something that we've pursued very strongly. So I'll leave you with that thought that we have turned down this exact thing
Okay.
before.
Okay.
And that would be a perspective of mine on that. Because once you get that camel's nose underneath the tent, unfortunately, it gets sort of out of control. Now, it's up to you, after taking a good look at the ordinances and speaking with the professional staff, what you would like to do. You may have a very, very compelling argument in order to do that, but that's the history behind it. Okay? Just want you to know that for you.
Okay.
Okay, I want to point out a couple things. First of all, remember that camel's nose underneath the tent. That's going to come back to play. They're not saying the same thing when they want to have this wildlife rehabilitation project that is a commercial usage, but we're going to get to that. The other thing is the mayor has the wrong parcel of land. There is a cornfield east of the natural gas station, but the area that this gentleman is talking about is where the old farmstead was, and they tore the farm down. So they're not even talking about the right thing. Second of all, this is a wooded area that isn't being used for anything, and it is in the commercial area. And you know, I guess what I'm saying is you can't have it both ways, and they're trying to. Now, when we get to this wildlife rehabilitation, that's a commercial venture, and they're putting it out in the middle of nowhere, like they did with the wedding barn, and they made an approval for a supper club in 96 in County Road 15, and the only reason that didn't fly is because the guy couldn't get the financing for it. So
Now, Mr. Cedarstrom, with the wedding barn, I would assume that if you're having weddings at the wedding barn, that you have to accommodate for having restrooms, correct?
right.
And so do they have city sewer and water there, or do they have a sanitary sewer system?
They have a big mound system.
So
See,
my follow-up question is exactly this. If it's okay for a wedding barn to have a mound system and a sanitary sewer system standalone, then why is it not okay that a storage facility that has very little need for water and sewage, why they also could not have a sanitary sewer system that is separate and independent from any city sewer and water?
well, that's the point I'm making. They're very inconsistent. They don't apply the zoning things evenly.
So
I mean,
I've gotten the point. I've gotten the point. Then, is that why couldn't they have a sanitary sewer system of their own?
well, they
And
don't-
he's talking about that this would cause the city to have to allow them to have city sewer and water. So I can see it's very inconsistent.
Well, they talk out of both sides of their mouth. It's okay for the wedding barn that has sewage for 200 people, but a storage facility that has one or two people come in at a time, and they don't exactly go there to party. And my goodness, they go there to drop your junk off and you leave. It isn't a destination for using the restrooms. And it's a long 36 where it doesn't create traffic. There's a frontage road. There's a bar down there, for Pete's sakes, and it's full all the time. Goodness, it's inconsistent application of zoning.
Definitely.
And they're just not logical. But now we're going to go to a bigger bugaboo.
Oh, no, a bigger one. How can that possibly be?
Sunnybrook Lake is down south of 12. It's off Jocelyn Lane, and there's consistent flooding. Last year, there was a proposal, CCS Contracting put in a temporary pump, and they pumped it 1,000 feet across Indian Hills Golf Course. And the gentleman that runs it was happy to run the pipe, and he's got some lowland that has a sand base, so the water would drain away. So that worked all this year. They took it out in November. And now they're talking about the county has bought, or the Valley Branch Watershed has bought 4 homes for $2 million
Wow.
because they were flooding. Now, here is a proposal. I've been to Valley Branch a number of times. Proposal, CCS Contracting, for the sum of $125,000, that we will provide a 6-foot concrete structure with a hatch, install a guide rail, pumps, check valves, gate valves for air compressor connection to blow out the main, install plumbing, install inlet pipe into Keats Palm, install a control panel, provide electrical service, provide a permit, and this would take care of the problem, because the soil around there is silt, loam, and clay, which doesn't drain well, and the roads act like dams, and that's what's happening.
So in other words, if they went with this proposal, they wouldn't have to buy 4 homes for the tune of $2 million.
That's right, and there's rocket science come up with these ideas. So now what they're going to do is they have 4 proposals. 1, to use gravel and raise the road a foot or 2. 2, to repave it, and its flood is 980, I believe, and they want to raise it up to 982. Then the other third project is a higher repaving and do it above the 100-year floodplain of 983 feet and redo it, and this is going to cost $100,000 to $200,000. Or number 4, not do anything at all. They did not once consider the pumping option, which would take care of the problem. It's taken care of it for the last 2 years, where we have a winter that there's a lot of snow. The ground is 99% saturated. Last year was a record year with 44 inches of precipitation. I monitor mine very carefully because I farm. And that was never mentioned, but they're willing to spend millions of dollars and spend all these things when the solution is right in front of them.
So I just want to be clear, is that who wants to spend the $2 million to buy the 4 houses?
Well, that was Valley Branch Watershed. They've already spent $2 million to buy the 4 houses, and now
Okay.
they're going to saving money in the budget for next year. The word is, what they're trying to do is buy all the houses and make a park out of it. Well, but they're using subterfuge. They're not coming out and saying that. They're saying, oh, you're flooding, we'll buy your house. Well, they're going to have to tear these houses down. And
Right.
The other thing is...
And then you've got all that that demolition costs added into this as well. And so the 4 proposals or possible proposals that you were outlining, that's coming from the city council level, correct?
That's correct.
And so how does that blend with what the Valley Branch is doing?
Well, they'd have to get permits, but the interesting thing is by raising roads, you're raising the dam, so the water will flood more instead of less. They're compounding the problem instead of solving it. If they would put a pumping station in for $125,000 when it went up, it would get automatically come on and get pumped out. It would be very minimum, but again, so we'll start to play some of this next clip and we'll go from there.
The staff to raise the roadways in the event of severe flooding for the Sunnybrook Lake watershed. The city staff has provided the following alternatives. Now, alternative 1, it would be a temporary emergency roadway. So this alternative includes adding aggregate base to the existing road to build it up to an elevation of 982.8 feet, as needed to accommodate rising water. Now, as needed, I would preface that by saying we could do some road maintenance to the road. We wouldn't be widening the road per se, but we could have our road maintenance build the road up as the floodwaters rise. So we wouldn't do anything initially, and we wouldn't do anything if the water never breached the road. But if it did, we could start having our road maintenance contractor build up the road as we go.
Mr. Cedarstrom, I just had to stop the clip there for a moment. The plan is, that I hear, is that we're going to build up the road somewhat, planning that maybe something will happen. And then when something does happen, then we'll get a hold of our road contractor and tell him to put a little bit more dirt on top of it to keep the water from going over it. Now that sounds like an incredible way to build a very solid road base, do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's hear what else he's got to say. I'm sure that there's some other nuggets of wisdom here.
And so that's the first alternative. And I have shown a cost for that of $109,000. Now that cost is a project cost, which should include engineering and a full build-out if, in the event, we would have to raise that road 3 feet. So, you know, we wouldn't necessarily build up the road unless we absolutely had to. And if we built the road up 3 feet, it would cost approximately $109,000. Now, I figured or assumed a 20% amount on top of the construction cost to determine the indirect cost. So if you looked at the engineer's estimate that I provided you, the construction cost is less than $100,000. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's around $70,000. So in that case, we could simply go out for quotes rather than going out for bids for the project. So alternate 2, I've defined here as a permanent road. And so alternate 2 is again adding aggregate base material to build up the new roadway to the elevation of 981.8 feet. The new roadway would become the permanent roadway and no other work would be needed. This alternative raises the road sufficiently to force the floodwaters to be conveyed through the existing culverts at 68th Court and Jocelyn Road and maximizes the available storage volume that surrounds the roads today. Again, that estimated project cost for this alternative is around $100,000.
Mr. Cedarstrom, I heard that the permanent road option actually is less than the temporary road option.
Well, the whole problem with this, it doesn't matter what kind of road they're talking about. They're talking about replacing with the same size culverts. And if the culverts didn't carry the water before, I don't care how high you build the road, it's still not going to drain it any faster. So the net effect is the water is going to, because the dam is higher, the water is going to be backing up further. And it's going to, it's going to flood the septic systems and make the houses uninhabitable.
Well, you know what? You're not an engineer, I'm not an engineer, and even we understand that principle. But I think he's probably got a little bit more of his words of wisdom. Let's see what they might be.
Again, that includes engineering and all those other soft costs. So the alternate number 3 is again another permanent road, but it would be adding to the road elevation, but we would build it up to that FEMA elevation or that 100-year flood elevation of 982.8 feet. Again, the new roadway would encroach on existing wetlands, driveway approaches, and culverts, and the new roadway would become the permanent roadway and no other work would be needed. This estimate is $193,000. So the last alternative is kind of the do-nothing alternative where we would just leave the roads at or near the existing elevations, and then we would have to work with other local agencies to implement an emergency action plan if floodwaters would exceed the roadway.
But there is another option, option number 5, which is exactly what Mr. Cedarstrom has here, which for $125,000, you can put in those pumping stations, and that takes care of it.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous that they would even consider doing what they're doing, making the dam larger so it'll flood more, when they're not changing the size of the culverts. In Valley Branch Watershed is totally incompetent on this. I've been down there many times explaining this, going through this, and they're ignoring it. But now this is going to get even more fun. Now we're going to hear the emergency response that the county's coming up with. So let's play that and talk on the other side. It involves boats too, so it'll be fun.
I can't wait.
Fire and our patrol commander on staging an airboat at Matamidi Fire And discussions with him about doing a tour there to take measurements and make sure that we'd be able to store it there, but his belief is that it would fit. Problem with that is they don't have pilots for the airboat at Matamidi Fire, so we'd have to tone out Stillwater Fire to have their pilots come to Matamidi Fire, hook up the boat, bring the boat here, launch the boat with law enforcement and fire depending on the call. So clearly, the delay is going to be extremely delayed. The issues with the fire trucks, that was part of the discussion on closing the road, Jocelyn, last fall, when water started to breach the road, and it's not a tarred road, so the integrity of what's underneath that water is unknown. And when you're driving a 50 or 60,000 pound fire engine through there, it's too unknown and too high risk. So another concern to consider is if we make the arrangements to, in terms of fire service or EMS, call mutual aid for calls that are on the south side of the road blockage, we can do that, and then in this case, Matamidi Fire would, go around and get there last, if you will. The issues with that is, if there's calls for service on the north side of that and your public safety folks are on the south side, that response is going to be delayed to areas that might not be affected by floodwaters because they're on the wrong side and they get a secondary or subsequent call. So that's what I meant by there's a lot of variables to consider on what this might look like. But regardless, from the law enforcement perspective, if the residents are going to stay there, we'll find a way to respond. And there's been
What are we going to do, give them all swimming lessons? I mean, this is just absolutely ridiculous. There's a solution for this, and it worked last year. The pumping station brought the water down, and it wasn't an issue. Why they cannot logically see this solution is beyond the copious of my diminutive comprehension. But now we're shifting gears. Oh boy, now we're going to this wildlife rehabilitation. I bought my 40 acres from the Kendrick farm, and there's a 15 and a 6 acre or 7 acre parcel down there. And they had to join them because they put a cell tower. Well, this is an old house that's split into a duplex, and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota has purchased it. And I went to the Planning Commission and made a presentation. I brought it with me, and I'll just briefly go over it. The Wildlife Rehab Center of Minnesota, one of the nation's busiest hospitals, admitting 15,000 patients annually. It's from the website, includes commercial coyotes. And what I said is this is a commercial operation which will bring extensive traffic into our quiet neighborhood from the 25 volunteers. They all planned for 7 to 10 accessory buildings, some being 30 by 60 and 30 by 70 in a future date. In addition, they were contemplating a surgery center. Well, I went over the chart, and there's no place in there that it says a wildlife rehab. At the bottom.
And this chart is from where?
This is from our code book, the city of Grant. At the bottom there it says wildlife preserve, reserve, not preserve, it's a wildlife reserve, public or private. Normally that means ground that is untouched, it's left wild so the animals can go around it. They may have feeding stations, but that's it. But the problem is,
Right, so you're saying that they're trying to hitch on the star of a wildlife preserve in order to have this wildlife rehabilitation center installed in their property.
that's right.
Okay.
And that's 32-245 Wildlife Reserve. Okay, then there's wild animals, 6-20. To protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens, it's unlawful to keep any wild, dangerous, or undomesticated animals within the corporate limits of the city. Gee whiz.
And so that's thinking, what, only like you can't have like a pet raccoon or a pet
That's right.
skunk or something like that. Well, what about a wild bobcat?
Would that be?
Would that be allowed?
Absolutely not. And so they can, we'll see in here they talk about they can take coyotes and bobcats and even bears, but usually we put them out. Well, what they usually do and what they do is something else. It's kind of like the mayor and deputy mayor don't look at what they say, look at what they do. So,
Well, I would think that certainly, yes, they put them out while they're doing surgery or something like that, but eventually these animals have to recover from their anesthesia.
Well, that's-
correct? And then they have to, isn't this rehabilitation where they are out of their anesthesia so that they can recover?
oh, that's what they do. After they've recovered from surgery, they want a place to warehouse the animals when they're recovering. And there's also, if they have like young bears or raccoons or deer, they have to feed them. And we'll have a discussion about that. But let's play the next clip. It's about the wildlife rehab, and we'll go from there.
Which cannot be verified in terms of do they meet setbacks, do they meet the buffer areas, et cetera, because the delineation has not been completed. So there are a couple outstanding issues when it comes to the wetlands. With respect to the proposed operations, it is a wildlife rehabilitation center. I'm going to emphasize the word rehabilitation because that's how it's been described by the applicant to me. For those of you that are familiar with our organization, they do have a veterinary hospital, wildlife veterinary hospital, that's in Roseville. That facility is proposed to remain as part of this and be part of the operations. So it's my understanding that really this location is really more about sort of that transition care between the hospital environment, then transition, then hopefully if all goes well, they're released back into the wild, but not from the site, which you'll see as a condition in the draft permit this evening. There are some veterinary services that would be provided on site, but not a lot. The vast majority of this is really about the rehabilitation and sort of that transition piece, which if you have questions about that and rehabilitation of squirrels, Mr. Jenny is here and he can certainly.
Wow, I am really concerned about the rehabilitation of squirrels and the impact on my neighborhood. But you mentioned, Mr. Cedarstrom, that it also includes bobcats and coyotes and bears.
Well,
Did they talk more about those?
Well, they're going to be talking about that. But the point is, they want to put 330 by 60 buildings and 330 by 70 buildings. At the beginning of that, if you saw on the screen, I should have pointed that out, all the buildings are going to put in there because there's no limit over 20 acres. Now, the interesting thing is, for example, I have 42, almost 43 acres. So according to code, I can have 21 horses. Now, I'm not going to build a horse barn for 100 horses if I can only have 21. And that's the same thing, it's common sense in agriculture. If you could have if you can only have 40 or 50 hogs on your property, that's the size of building you're going to build. Unless, you can go for a stockyard or a feeding lot, but then you go to the state of Minnesota and there's a whole different ballgame. But we're going to have all these animals, all these cages, and the interesting thing is, like horses, they don't do a very good job of digesting food, so about half of what comes up is just chewed up grass. When you're talking about having a bunch of animals that are carnivorous, the excrement from those is much more smelly and volatile. And where are they going to get rid of this? This guy says in one of his presentations, oh yeah, we just put it in the garbage. Well, that isn't very appropriate either. And again, this is a commercial operation, and they're not saying a darn thing about, oh, it's commercial. Now, gee whiz, something as busy as a storage center, oh, it's commercial, the sky is falling. And it's in a business district. They're out in the middle of a neighborhood, and they're talking about installing a commercial basis. But
And more than likely, the reason that they are claiming they're not commercial is, are they a nonprofit?
they're a nonprofit.
And
That's it.
so that's sort of the mincing of words. And so they may be a nonprofit, so they may not be operating for profit, so therefore not commercial. But your point is that the impact and the amount of people and traffic and other considerations is equivalent to if it was a commercial practice going on.
Well,
so just because they have a different way that they're classified for tax purposes, that isn't necessarily indicative of the impact they have on the community.
Oh, absolutely. Now they're
Right.
going to cross it with a vet clinic. Watch how they twist and turn the words, and it's just ridiculous. Play this clip and we'll talk on the other side.
From a dimensional standard perspective, when we take a look at the two uses, so essentially the way staff looked at this is it's kind of a hybrid between two uses in the use table, the table of uses. So we've got a wildlife preserve that's identified on the city's table of uses, and then we have veterinary services or a veterinary clinic that is on the table of uses. With the wildlife preserve is simply permitted, so had we gone in that direction, we wouldn't be sitting here because they would have just gone and done the application, or not even done the application, they just would have begun their operations. The veterinary service or the veterinary component of it, so the veterinary service portion of it, really falls under a conditional use permit and is something that is permitted with a conditional use permit in the A1 zoning districts.
They don't mince the words. They're getting technical on the storage, but this is not a wildlife preserve. This is a wildlife rehab. I mean, that's like saying all the cars are the same, a Chevrolet and a Ferrari. They're both cars, they're the same thing.
Well, the distinction that I see is that an animal preserve, the animals run free, correct?
That's right.
This location, this use, the animals are not running free. They're being housed and they are being kept there for a period of time. And so your concern has to do with, are the numbers of animals that are being there, I mean, that would probably be a higher number than if it were simply an animal preserve.
Absolutely.
See, so there's a distinction there in many levels.
And then the number of buildings they're going to be using. So
Right.
let's go next to the site plan.
You saw it in your packets. I'm going to do my best. The heavier, the darkest boxes that folks can see up here are really where the proposed improvements are. In light gray, there are existing accessory buildings in the existing principal structure. You can also see where the main access point is off Jamica. That driveway, as I stated before, is proposed to remain in place and be used to support the operations. Most of the smaller rectangles that are on the site plan are the caged areas. So those are sort of outdoor or semi-enclosed areas. Based on the narrative, all of those areas are proposed to be double fenced. The larger structures, so there's one kind of, I always forget my little pointer doesn't work in here, but it's sort of in the middle and it's kind of in a T shape or more T-shaped than others. That is the main nursery facility that's proposed. And then south of there, there's a large rectangle. That large area is the proposed waterfowl facility. In your packets this evening, the Brown Creek Watershed provide additional response between the Planning Commission and the meeting today. And I haven't had a chance to speak with the applicant about.
Is Browns Creek already has said they can't put the pond area there for the ducks because it's on a steep hill and it's going to be going into a wetland. Well, so that's already a done deal. They can't do that, but they're planning this grandiose stuff. There's so many buildings on there already that they're going to have like 32,000 square foot of buildings there, which is insane for the amount of land it is. There's already a cell tower there.
That's a lot of recovering squirrels. You realize that. How many recovering squirrels could they house?
I don't know, it sounds kind of nutty to me. And they're, it is just out of control. And they're talking about they're going to have 4 or 5 people living on site, and that issue is going to come up again. They're talking about having 20 employees coming and going. They have a shift in the morning and a shift in the afternoon. Well, how much traffic is this going to be? It's just kind of insane. That's why I'm saying this is a commercial, a wildlife reserve. You don't have anybody driving in and out. Vets stations, Stillwater Vet, it's along 36, by the way. I've been there many times, I use them. And there's not that many cars coming and going. Morning and night, there's going to be cars coming and going to feed the animals, clean the cages. They feed them in the morning, they clean the cages, they feed them at night, they clean the cages. So there's going to be Lord knows how many people coming. in the morning and some in the afternoon, and they're going to have 4, well, actually, they wanted 5 people to live on site, and that's going to rear its ugly head a little bit later. But you notice they don't say much about this. Oh, it's okay, oh, it's okay. But these,
Right,
these
and Mr. Cedarstrom, I don't want our viewers to get the wrong, the wrong, impression here, is that certainly it's important that there be facilities for wildlife rehabilitation. That's not really the real issue. The issue is the fact that they're not discussing it with reality, and that they're not being truthful about how they're presenting this use. Because quite frankly, if you presented it as it really will operate, and the kind of impacts that it will have, which are similar to being commercial, then the elected officials can put in the proper conditions in that conditional use permit to address those issues. That if you are having traffic, what are the hours of which that they can come and go? If there's going to be a problem with safety issues, what are the precautions of what has to be taken? How often is it going to be inspected by somebody from the city to make sure that those safeguards are in place? Because if you are doing rehabilitation to bobcats and bears and coyotes, you want to make sure that there's safety precautions. But who's monitoring those safety precautions? Who's making sure that they're going to be in place? Those are all things that could be part of that conditional use permit. But if they're not talking about the project as it really is, but instead talking about it superficially and trying to gloss over all those things, then you don't have the proper protections for the neighborhood.
Well, they're already talking about hours they wanted from 7 in the morning to 11 at night in parking for 35 cars. But let's go to the next.
Right, but is that consistent with the character of the neighborhood?
Absolutely
Which,
not.
as you know, as a council member, conditional use permits, that is part of what those conditions look at, is how to keep it consistent with the character of the neighborhood. That's why you put conditions on there. So to say that the hours of operation can be till 11 o'clock at night, does that mean then that the guy who has the farm next door, if there is a farm next door, can he be operating his farm equipment till 11 o'clock at night? You see, there's noise ordinances too, aren't there, in the city of Grant?
Absolutely.
And so there's other kinds of considerations, and they all have to be measured by the same considerations. And I think that's really your point.
Yep, absolutely. Let's play the next clip and we'll talk on the other side.
Mr. Carr and I approved a CUP about 5 years ago for a supper club on one of our main corners, our main drags. And that supper club at the time came to us with a building about this size, with a building plan, with blueprints, with exactly what was happening with it, with exactly everything else that was going to be built out, but at the time had no funding. So they were out looking for funding the same way this organization is going to be doing. That's something to keep in mind as we look at this, and I'm sure Mr. Carr remembers that very well. Number two, the CUP process is not only to benefit a landowner, it's to make the landowners and the neighbors around it both aware of it and to protect their use and quiet enjoyment of their properties as well. And as Jen said, the reason that, for example, just to pick an example out of the air here, the waterfowl center that I see there of another 6,000 square feet, but is not really going to be added to this project for possibly years, depending on the fundraising that the organization does. Well, once the neighbors get used to having a certain operation and then these operations change and we don't have any specific plans, and when the plans that we are hearing about are on incredibly steep slopes overlooking a pond and probably can't be built on without variances, I start to look at the CUP application not in the same light, but certainly along the same vein of the gentleman who was in here earlier that wanted to build a mini storage but provided us absolutely no information at all. Now, this one has some information, but I have a lot of open questions on this, and I'm just going to preface this as a start with that in terms of what the mayor's observations are at this point. Now, gentlemen?
Now Washington County doesn't want to put in a turn lane for them. They wanted to have a road off 107th, which is this road I'm on. It's a quiet residential. When they gave the conditional use permit for the cell tower, they specifically said they had to widen the driveway and access it from Jamica or the county road because they didn't want commercial trucks going through the neighborhood. Now, the county says, well, we don't know about the traffic, so therefore you have to have it off 107th, and they're not going to allow that. They're finally closing in and realize what a can of worms this whole project is. And that ultimately they're telling them to go back and bring the details, but hopefully something will change. The next big thing they're going to be talking about is the turn lane, okay? So why don't we play that clip and we'll talk on the other side.
Especially considering there's going to be all this traffic, you kind of need a turn lane, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
And I can't speak for them, but I did have a conversation with the county, and they said that the spacing between the turn lanes may not be, and as Brad might want to jump in here if he knows more about turn lane spacing than I do, but they made reference to the fact that the turn lane spacing between the turn lane that would get you into this and then the turn lane that gets you to 107th is too short, the distance doesn't work. Which is why they recommended the 107th as opposed to putting two turn lanes in a row. So my point is, I don't know that the county would permit you to do that or not.
Right.
Which is why part of this, from my perspective, and why the county came back with the position that they did, is we don't really understand the number of trips per day that we're actually talking about. Because that's typically what necessitates the turn lane improvements, a dedicated turn lane one way or the other. And because we don't have an actual count, they came down on the position of, well, then just make them use 107th because we don't know. So
In the next clip, they finally come out and admit that it is a commercial use. That's what's really interesting. And it's not allowed on the chart, on the zoning district chart that I
Right, which
have
is
right
in your
here.
ordinances, right?
And so they're making a big deal, and there was a big discussion about that. It's all the picayune stuff, when if the thing as it is now should not be going in. What I'm saying, if there was if they put up one 30 by 60 or 30 by 70 building to housing a few animals, not a problem. But they also want cages outside after they get larger so they can be in the wild. Well, the other problem with that is going to be you put a bunch of bunnies and whatever else, even if it's in a double cage.
I
know
don't
what I'm
think you're
saying?
really worried about bunnies, though, are you?
No, well, actually, I
You're
was,
talking about those bobcats.
no, I was actually going to go in for a CUP. I wanted to have a bunny rehabilitation center for two-legged bunnies, but they turned me down on that. But what I'm saying is they're going to have fenced-in cages out there. Well, what do you think the coyotes are going to do? The coyotes are going to be coming in and howling and making all kinds of noise with this heavy concentration of prey. They think they're going to be going to the Old Country Buffet. Maybe they're going to have to change the name. But let's go to the next clip, and we'll go from there.
It's 6 or into our zoning in 32, under vet hospital, this looks as though it fits. We have injured animals. These injured animals are being treated. I won't quibble over whether or not rehabbing them or whatever is treating them. And they're treating the animals to go back to the wild. That, for me, is without question. Where the questions are for me in this application, they're much more structural. We've talked about turn lanes, we've talked about lighting, we've talked about parking. Those are all concerns of mine as well. In fact, I might as well start there in terms of my structural discussion here. When we were talking about the cell tower access to this property, the reason that it's a 20-foot driveway and that it looks the way it looks is so that those great big cell phone trucks could get in there and do maintenance on that. We nixed very, very quickly and very thoroughly any access to that cell phone tower from 107th. We did that in order to protect long-standing residents over there from having even that amount of commercial traffic coming in. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to support an access from 107th. What John is saying here, what almost everyone here is saying, is that this is a veterinary clinic for all intents and purposes, although it's called a rehab center. It is a commercial, although not operated for profit. Understood. Still a commercial use. It needs to come off of a county road, as far as I'm concerned. There are many different ways for that to happen. The county, I'm sure, would work with you on that.
They're finally admitting that this, in fact, is a commercial use. And it shouldn't be allowed in this area, you know?
Now, I do find this fascinating, though, that Mayor Huber is calling this a commercial operation. Because remember, back a year and a half or so ago, we did news programs on the dumping of sludge by a company that was certainly for profit, and you claimed that was a commercial operation, and Mayor Huber claimed up and down that was not a commercial operation. So what do you think is the reason for his turnabout in being able to recognize something is now commercial, that before something that was commercial he would deny up and down that it was not commercial?
Not being a psychiatrist, I cannot analyze his psychosis. But I know there is a problem there. It's inconsistent. They keep blathering about, oh, keep this rural, we want our home in the country. Well, what in God's green earth are they do, putting a heavily high-usage commercial operation in the middle of a nicer neighborhood? This is just insanity.
And that sewage operation, that dumping operation, the city of Grant allowed that to go on for quite some time, didn't
Oh, yes,
they?
the way we got the hydrovac dumping shut down is I went to the MPCA. Now, I proposed 3 times when I was on the council a change to the ordinance to eliminate hydrovac dumping and adding it to our ordinance that said there can be no dumping of wastewater within 3,000 feet of a well. Well, I'll tell you, there was 20 houses within 3,000 feet of this well, and they ignored it. Again,
Right.
This is a perception issue. It depends which way the wind's blowing. And
your definition of commercial, right? But that guy was dumping that stuff for profit, correct?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I think your definition of commercial was very accurate in that case.
Well, let's go to the next clip, and this is another thing they're running into a problem with the house.
About the house, since this is not going to be a family residence, it might be deemed commercial lodging from our building inspector. It might require a little bit more intensive safety issues, door exits, lights. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that thought came to my mind because you're going to have people there. And that would be our esteemed building inspector, who's pretty good at that stuff. To Jeff's point about having some of this stuff, laid out better.
I think also ADA compliance.
Well, one of the other issues is they're proposing having 5 people living in the house when we have ordinances that said only 4 unrelated people can live in one house. So, gee whiz, another broken rule we've got here. I mean, why don't they just throw the damn ordinance book away and say, hey, do whatever the hell you want if I like you. If you don't, we're going to nail you to the wall. The last little clip we have is the motion to table. Let's play that and we'll talk on the other side.
I'll second.
Thank you very much. All those in favor of tabling, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you, Mr. Jenny.
May I make one more?
So they tabled it, and with direction to how to change the application and then come back, or did they, what did they do?
They gave them a 60-day window extension. They want to come back because there are several issues. The waterfowl has to go through Browns Creek, and Browns Creek has already said there's no way we're going to let you put a building with a runoff from 100 ducks that goes into a wetland. So that's done. We have too many people living in the house. We have the high level of traffic, 25 people coming and going. Oh, it's only from April till November 1st. Well, yeah, so it is December, January, February, March, nobody, but they have 2 shifts for feeding people, so that's the problem. Then they're talking about all these buildings. There's already 10 buildings on this site. And these are large buildings. There's a large chicken house. There's a couple other barn-type buildings. Of course, now they also have it for horses, so there's 2 or 3 lean-tos for horses. And there's a big garage. There's 10 buildings already on the site, and now they're talking about putting in 6 more, plus double-fenced areas that are 8-foot-high chain link with barbed wire around the top to keep any animals from getting into the critters that they have inside, because they want to keep, we want to keep them wild, so after they're rehabilitated to a certain stage, we put them out in the open so they can, in a large pen, so they can feed on their own and keep wild. Well, yeah, you have all these critters in a cage, you think the coyotes aren't going to find them and be there howling and making a mess? So from the commercial usage, the intensity of use, the traffic, this is just ridiculous.
Right, so in other words, they could have just simply denied the application, correct?
That's absolutely right.
Because the application was deemed by the applicant to be complete. I mean, because that's what part of the process is that if you have an application to a city for a use like this, and you're going before them, I mean, the staff makes sure that all the materials are in the application first, and that once it's complete, then the 60 days start to run for the decision, either yes or no, or to extend that 60 days. So at this point, certainly the application would be considered complete, and the council could have just said denied, gave their reasons, then put their reasons in writing and sent those written reasons to the applicant, and they'd be done, rather than saying, come back with a few little tweaks.
Well, the whole problem is, and we didn't cover it here, one of the things they did not provide is the permit from the DNR to show which animals they could in fact have.
Oh, well, that's a shortcoming.
They talked about raccoons and possums and bears and coyotes, but they said, oh yeah, but they always have this disclaimer, oh yeah, but we sent the one up to St. Cloud, the bear we had. Well, yeah, but if they have the permit to do it, to have a bear there, in the future, it could happen.
Right, so nobody really saw their permit to know in reality what they're allowed to have.
Oh, and it's a very soft plan. They don't have it. The plan that was put up there, it was hard to see, but they were putting all these kind of buildings up. They want a parking lot for 35 cars. Well, if you have a parking lot for 35 cars, what does that tell you? You probably need at least 30 of them. And they're going to have 4 to 5 people living on site, plus they're going to have interns from the University of Minnesota, because that's what this uses. So there's going to be a lot more people there than they're letting on. Mm-hmm. There's going to be much more going on there. And if you have one of the $500,000 houses that's right next, you think you're not going to smell some stench?
And here's another thing I want to mention too in our last couple minutes is that in one of the cases that I've had where my client was a Buddhist monastery, because even though it was a religious organization, they still had to comply with certain regulations because they were having people from the public or employees coming to their facility. So when you're talking about sanitary sewer, again, going back to that storage unit that wanted to construct on that one little parcel in that business area. This idea about their sanitary sewage. Well, this particular wildlife rehabilitation center is going to have to accommodate the sanitary sewage for 25 employees. And did that ever come up in this discussion at the city council?
Absolutely not. They haven't even touched on that. And what's so ridiculous is they don't want a very quiet thing in a commercial area, but they decide to put a high traffic commercial area in a quiet neighborhood.
Intense use.
Very intense use.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. Just as much as it doesn't make sense to raise the roads and make the dam higher to flood more houses instead of putting in a pumping station. These guys are in the twilight zone, I'm here to tell you. And it isn't just Rod Sterling, needless to say. But,
well, and of course, here we are making sure everybody knows that they're in the twilight zone.
Okay. Well, thank you, Diana. Once again, you always shed very interesting light on it and use your legal expertise. Next month, we'll come back, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of other things going on. I've exposed a number of things. Last month we did the Mahtomedi schools. This month it's the mayor and the redwood planks and the wildlife Rehabilitation Center. So we'll see what kind of stuff we can dig up for next month. So join us, if you will, next month, and we'll show you what's going in and all around Grant.
Thank you.